Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Nasanov and the Space Madness podcast, and this is Wednesday. My co-host. This is our second episode, and today I'm delighted to talk with a very interesting person named Tim Chrisman, who I've recently come to know. A wide variety of background experiences and a lot of interesting perspectives on the world and space exploration, technology, and so on. Just as a reminder for everyone, the Space Madness podcast, so named because I have found that a life dedicated to space exploration is maddening. As I said in yesterday's episode, it is such a complex undertaking, no matter who does it, that it is inevitably intertwined with global events, business, technology, politics, natural disasters. It takes long enough that any major mission takes long enough that it invokes people's entire careers, or at least their children's childhoods, and so on. So, Space Madness, I imagine I'll have a different introduction every time, but the more I talk, the more I like the name. So that's me. Thanks for joining us. And Tim, please introduce yourself however you like.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to be here, Jeff. And I agree that anything on the frontier requires a little bit of madness, just by virtue of the fact that we're outside societal norms. So it looks like madness to the rest of the world. But yeah, Tim Chrisman, former Army Special Operations, former CIA. The CIA was where I got my start in deep tech. I swindled my way into their Space Department and have been in and around space and other deep tech verticals ever since. Right now, I help run a deep tech venture fund and just joined a high energy laser counter drone company as their vice president for government growth.
Great, super interesting. I looked into the laser company. My neighbor here in Atlanta works for Delta, and so I always ask him aviation questions. And I haven't asked him about this yet, but and speaking of deep tech, I did do a ChatGPT deep research. I just said, and this was half to test ChatGPT and half because I wanted the answer. I said, look at the website for this company, Thor Dynamics, I think it's called. Yep. And what are the challenges in using it at the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport to deter birds from hovering or from flying at the runways? I imagine there's a term of art other than deter, but it actually gave me pretty interesting stuff. I haven't even read it all, everything from the obvious using lasers as an airport problem to various regulatory obligations that are pretty interestingly phrased, such as there is a regulatory obligation to protect runways from wildlife.
Right.
And you could make the argument that there's a conflict in that because on the one hand there are regulations against using lasers at a runway. On the other, but there's also a prescriptive obligation to use emerging technologies to do that. So
yeah.
We'll save that for another conversation. But seemed like an interesting thing. And so I want to go back to I think listeners will hear Army and CIA and some curiosity will come up. I'm curious, what can you tell us about that journey? And I mean, really, whatever you can say, I'm sure would be interesting. And every time I ask you that, I learn more. So, please.
Yeah. No. I've been very fortunate to have multiple times set out long-term goals to make it to the pinnacle of some organization or some vertical in the national security architecture, and get to the top and have that rare experience of feeling like I made it, and is this all there is? And damn it, now what? It has not deterred me from continuing to do that. But now I know that it's never actually going to be enough, and I don't have illusion of that. But no, I joke with my kids and my wife that my non-disclosure agreements last 75 years, and so all of my longevity treatments that I'm doing are so that I can outlive that NDA and talk about some of these things. Because although some of what I did you can see in movies, I can't even say the names of some of the units I worked with in the military, even though they are in fact literal movie titles. And it's like, okay, this is kind of goofy. Same with stuff at the CIA. Like, they can put this in a Jack Ryan movie, and everybody else can talk about it. I can't directly associate with it, and so I can say, in the military, supported a lot of special operations units, 5 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, did a lot of bad things to bad people, and that's a fun thing to do as a kid. From 18, 19 to almost 30, that's pretty much the sweet spot for carrying hundreds of pounds on your back for tens of miles, and running 4.5-minute miles. I don't want to do that anymore.
Sure. Well, I really like that the way you described that, of getting to the top of some system or organization, or even just seeing the top, and knowing it's the top. That to me has been the key, and wondering, wow, this is it. And for me at NASA, it was a lot of, wow, we've done quite a bit with. We've accomplished quite a lot with the leadership as it is and the organizations as they are.
Yeah.
Sometimes inspiring, sometimes not. And so I think we share that kind of desire to see how things work, and improve how things work.
Yeah.
And sometimes have to move on, in my case, voluntarily or otherwise, to the next thing. And that's actually a big reason what this podcast is, because my interest is, now that I know how NASA works, my interest is well, what, now I should add, now that I know how NASA works, and now that we see that the continuous leadership of NASA since the 1950s is maybe not as permanent as we thought, while at the same time there's been significant progress towards technological parity around the world, what is the 21st century, or the next, I guess it's really only 3/4 of the 21st century left. What does that look like as other nations take different steps, either in the absence of American leadership or in combination with it? And I'm actually reminded of the fact that the UK and France built the Concorde during the Cold War because they couldn't contribute to the lunar landing efforts. And I find that a really interesting bit of human and organizational psychology, that these nations really wanted to contribute in a big way, but they couldn't do the biggest thing, so they did the next biggest thing. And so I find that really interesting. One of the things that I like that you've written is this book about the third age of geopolitical capital, private capital. I'm butchering the title, please correct me. But basically the observation that increasingly, very rapidly, that the influence of private capital around the world is matching or even surpassing that of governments, and the speed at which that capital can be deployed to do things that once were the sole form of governments, is really a new world. So please start with the name of the book that I butchered, and I just, every time I ask you about it, I learn something new. So what are your thoughts since the last time we talked about that?
Yeah. No, so the book is Private Capital, Public Consequences. And it really is looking at how capital has shaped geopolitics throughout history, and how there's really been 3 ages of geopolitical capital, and how we're in this 3rd age right now, where private capital is the dominant force driving innovation, driving the speed of change. Whereas before, you had like public markets, or even earlier still, you had sort of public spending. You could only go to war as a country if you could levy the taxes to pay for the soldiers. And that was why there was like the colonial push, historically, was where do we find gold? Literal gold, so that we can go to war. And or be prepared to go to war in case somebody else goes to war with us. Which in hindsight is like for people currently, it's like, what do you mean we would need gold to go to war? Like, we go to war for any reason at all. We're America. But
Yeah,
historically, that's
and
not actually been possible.
and without contemporary financing, always
Right.
it. Now I'm curious. What was the first? Now I just want to know what was the first war financed by debt in human history. Now I just want to know that. I don't know if that's even if that historical fact is captured anywhere, but
No, I mean,
seems
there's been a
significant.
number of pretty early conflicts that had some sort of debt
Mm-hmm.
financing, and most of those had to end early because debtors were like, we're not doing this anymore. Or it resulted in a regime change because the debtors were called in the debts. And so you go back, and a lot of the antagonism in Europe towards the Jews was from their financing of rival powers. And so a lot of countries got it in their head that, they financed this kingdom or that kingdom, and that kingdom's at war with us, therefore those guys are the problem. Never mind the fact that France is invading you. It's not necessarily their Jewish bankers that are causing France to invade you.
Yeah, and it's one of those lenses for history thing. The corollary to that would be, as I understand it, that the Jewish people were often excluded from various professions on biblical grounds, scriptural grounds, and then and had fewer options, and so ended up in financing roles and so on. So it formed this cycle of perception over several thousand years that no doubt was warped in all kinds of directions at different times for different people's interests. So, yeah, that's a really interesting. Again, yet another thing. I'm sure there's 1,000 books written on. So, you mentioned you reminded me of something that when you're talking about your CIA experience, you reminded me of something that I've run into a lot, which is, so I've never had a clearance, and so I've had questions of people with clearances like, what happens if I think of something that's already real, that's covered by classification or security rules?
Yep.
And I've basically been told that no, that if that happens, you'll never know because you can't be told. And okay, fair enough. I'm pretty sure, run into walls on calls where there was one case where I was wondering out loud, how close do you have to be to another satellite to really observe its capabilities? And someone said, Jeff, stop. And okay, fine. Okay, fair enough. Fine. If I come up with something, I'll maybe it'll be new. It actually connects to an observation I've had about NASA over the years that, again, I think I've partially verified, which is that in some cases, the instruments that we develop to study other planets, other star systems, measure things at great distances, probably have been developed already by someone else, but NASA can't use it and has to develop its own version. I have come to conclude that that's probably true in some cases, simply from a logic point of view. I'm not asking you to confirm or deny it, but it makes me, it's just an interesting detail about the world, and I imagine that the vast majority of NASA people maybe aren't aware they're maybe reinventing something.
Yeah.
And
that doesn't even require the aliens at Area 51 transferring tech to us for that.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I know, actually, I meant to say this earlier. Speaking of very long NDAs, my grandfather, who I could talk about at length, he escaped Nazi Germany, ended up working at the Aerospace Corporation. And the first time I applied for a job there, I tried to, use his name, and I said, "Hey, Gerald Heyman worked here," and they basically said they couldn't even acknowledge that. But the next time I applied 10 years later, some period had elapsed where it was now acceptable to tell me about it. And so I learned that he had worked on ground station engineering for something called the Defense Support Program.
Oh, yeah.
Which I understand to have been one of the first satellites detecting infrared pulses caused by nuclear weapons. So So, and that squares with something he told me when I was a kid. He never talked about it, with the one exception that he said he once went to Greenland, and when they got off the plane, they were told if you don't get indoors within 30 seconds, your eyeballs will freeze. And so I never forgot that, and I thought of it frequently actually when I lived in Wisconsin, and it was below negative 20 degrees below zero. I think it has to be way colder than that for your eyeballs to freeze, but you don't
Yeah, I
forget
mean, I've
something
been
like
outside
that.
at like 60 below, and your eyeballs do get real chilly.
Oh yeah, so I forgot you're from North Pole, Alaska.
I
Do I
was
have that right?
born, yep, born in North
Okay,
Carolina.
not the actual North Pole, but a city called North Pole, which I didn't know was a thing, and I think is just a delightful.
Yep.
I mean, I'm curious. How did you go from the city of North Pole, Alaska, to, to Iraq? What was your?
Quickly.
Okay, so
Too quickly. Yeah, that's where you don't learn about ticks and snakes and hot weather injuries in Alaska because we don't have any of those. And
fair enough.
learned about all those in very rapid succession between training in Georgia and then going overseas
Okay,
to Iraq
so it sounds like you got out of Alaska as soon as you could.
as soon as I could.
Okay.
Did ROTC in college
Oh, okay.
and was in Iraq by 19.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So you said you did training in Georgia. Was that Fort Benning?
Yeah.
I believe that's where my grandfather trained in the early 40s.
Oh, okay.
Actually, yeah. And one of the things he barely ever mentioned Nazi Europe or even his military service, but he did mention that the racism he saw there was worse than Nazi Europe.
Yeah.
In Fort Benning in the early 40s. So as a current resident of Georgia, 100 years later, almost, not quite, but it puts all that in perspective.
Oh, right, right.
So, so I wonder if you could opine a bit about kind of the interaction between the private capital era, and actually, I wanted to make an observation that I think I've run past you. I'm not sure. Would you agree that it was the post World War II economic success of the U.S. that created all that capital that we're now seeing, or rather, derivatives of it? Is that an oversimplification, or
Yeah,
do you think
I
that
mean,
that makes sense?
I prefer oversimplification.
Okay.
It's easier to access, and it makes experts uncomfortable, and that's one of my favorite pastimes.
Okay.
Is saying something that they can't technically object to, but they really want to.
Fair.
So yes, I would say the post World War II boom is what created the capital markets that enabled public capital to thrive. The diversification of that in the 70s and 80s is what directly led to private capital's emergence.
When you say public, you mean things like public
Stock
equity.
markets,
Okay, so
bond
public
markets.
equity markets as opposed to public spending.
Right, correct.
Okay, right. So the enormous, unprecedented military spending created the conditions for the private, well, for the public markets with private ownership.
Correct.
That now we're seeing everything being, private equity dominated, and just half disclaimer, half just statement. I'm slowly getting involved in trying to arrange private equity deals, partially because it is the way the world works.
Yeah.
I want to learn the way the world works, but it's also relevant here because I recently went to this aviation conference that was here in Atlanta, and I was looking for a company to present to some buyers, and which was its own experience because I spent 10 years trying to raise money,
Yeah.
and suddenly I was walking around trying to spend the money.
Yep.
So that was, I never got,
It's a lot more fun.
well, it was fun, but it was very interesting because every single company I spoke to had already been approached by a dozen private equity companies, and so it made me see, it showed me just how much this is happening
Yeah.
probably above every industry. And I think, and not to generalize my own previous ignorance, but I think largely unknown to most people, most general people who are working 40 hours a week for a company, whether publicly traded or not. So it strikes me as a change that's not just impactful, but so fast that the general awareness is way behind.
Yeah, no, and that's something that investors in like venture funds, private equity funds look at a lot is does the team running this fund have some sort of special access to those deals? 'Cause otherwise, why should I bother with them?
Okay.
And so that's where it really pays to be able to have that unique access, whether it's like with Thor Ventures, us being a preferred capital provider to DARPA, helping them spin out companies and commercialize their tech, or other funds that have relationships with university accelerators.
Sure.
You know, having that first access to deals really sets funds apart.
So I want to go back to that DARPA connection, but I want to contextualize a little bit. My own startup experience was all in this world without really realizing the implications, or rather the larger context. Again, because I had an infant and a toddler, and I was trying to do it all. But basically, my team we had identified a radar device built at JPL at the request of the Department of Homeland Security for disaster response. And I had an idea that it could be used for medical applications. And through an enormous networking effort, I got invited to join this program in San Francisco called IndieBio in 2015, which was a biotech accelerator funded by an Irish billionaire with a telecom background. And so at the time, I wasn't looking all those steps up, although when I met him, some of this larger web kind of coalesced in my head. But I personally have been, that company ended up folding when the government shut down in 2019. But it was among the greatest learning experiences of my life, and in trying to both see the world as an entrepreneur, at the risk of being cliched, channeling Steve Jobs, or one of his commencement addresses where he asked his students, look down at the chair you're sitting in. Somebody had to create that chair. Somebody had to start a company at some point and decide, there's demand for this chair, so we need to start making. So, at the risk of quoting Steve Jobs ad nauseum, I found that to be a really interesting summation of that experience of looking at the world not as a consumer, but as someone trying to create something to be consumed. And that built on my NASA career, where I was trying to find U.S. government money, mostly NASA money, for missions. And I had this observation 10, 15 years ago. Why am I spending my time fighting for a shred of the federal budget, which is big, but when there's all this other capital out there, and I think I can make the case that these space missions they produce value, and so why not try to make that connection? But that's, I can go on about that. But to get back to your comment about DARPA, I think that a lot of people, maybe they know DARPA created the internet. Maybe they know DARPA was created to prevent technological surprise after Sputnik. But I'd love to hear more from you about this relationship between private capital funds and DARPA, and presumably government technological needs and so on. Just one last point. I read this fascinating book called Dark Eagles that I think you'd like. It's about the spy aircraft development in the 50s. And one of the things that's discussed is that at that time, there were no conflict of interest rules at all. There were contracts handed between friends, But and maybe this is the historical lens sort of washing the story, but the author wrote that at that time it was viewed as a civic duty, as an obligation, as a post-war honor to be handed the responsibility of creating the next generation of capabilities. I'm a naive guy. I'm not naive enough to think that's all it was, but it that really stuck out to me in reading that, trying to imagine a world where right after World War II you realize we have to reinvent everything because the other guy is. So back to you, DARPA, private capital. Love to hear
Well, and I think
how you put it
that's
together.
useful context because that is the era when most of our systems were built. You know, everybody had just gone through a massive upheaval that was indisputably bad. Millions of people are dying around the world. Everybody knows somebody who's at war. If you're not at war, you are supplying something for the war effort. And so, you know, we don't have a current analog to that. Some people have argued COVID was close, but you had a solid portion of the country who was like, it's not that bad. Nobody was necessarily saying World War II was not that bad. There were people who were saying maybe we should be less involved, but nobody was denying millions of people are dying around the world. And so you have this cohort of tens of millions of people who come back, and there's a sense of shared sacrifice. And like, we need to prevent this from happening again. The Soviets look like they're trying to make another go at this. So we've got to band together to make sure this doesn't happen. And so a lot of our systems were built assuming good intent on the part of the actors.
Now, I don't want to stop you, but when you say systems, I imagine you're talking about everything from international political systems, domestic agencies, technological systems, and one of the other things from this book that really struck out at me was that basically the Cold War started the day after V-Day, and that in a lot of ways it was continuous. That they literally started the spy plane flights the next day, and that the idea of this gap, at least that I had learned historically and through osmosis, culturally, that that World War II and the Cold War were discrete things separated. That's a fiction.
Yeah.
And I thought that was remarkable. So please go on.
There was a big push at the time to continue pushing east and invade the Soviet Union. And a number of senior generals, including Patton, died shortly after advocating for this because he was not a great driver. But the other generals advocated for, hey, we're already winning. The Soviets are never going to be our friends. Let's just finish this.
Wow.
Yeah.
I imagine for decades after, people were probably thinking maybe we should have done that, or I mean that's
yeah.
wow. I didn't know that. Yeah. That's really interesting. Another interesting historical detail for the historically minded listener comes from this book, Vietnam: An Epic Tragedy, that I was at Barnes and Nobles, and I randomly walked past it. It was like this thick. And I got the audiobook. It took 36 hours to listen to it. But one of the most interesting things that I learned that I had not learned about Vietnam was, well, two things. One was that the French involvement continuing from the 40s, I guess it's really just one thing, but it's a big thing. That I think is relatively well known. But that the U.S. financial support was explicitly in exchange for France acknowledging the rearmament of Germany, and that the follow-on of the German aggression in World War II literally set the stage for the American involvement in Vietnam, and I had never heard that, but it connects these eras. Speaking of long, engagements by the U.S. and globally, in a new way that I never read before. I'll put these books I keep bringing up in the show notes, but utterly fascinating to think back to the 50s and imagine the rationale behind
Yeah.
pressuring, but basically paying France to acknowledge Germany, and then the U.S. getting stuck there fighting the Soviets in a proxy war for 20 years, 20, 30 years. Anyway, it makes the case for, hey, maybe governments need some more private involvement in making these decisions. So back to DARPA and modern technology roadmaps and private capital and all that.
Yeah, no, so DARPA has realized over the past few years that um, it used to be totally doable for DARPA to incubate technology, push it out to the military, have some defense contractor make it, and that be that. And what I think they began to realize with the COVID vaccine was that that ensures that the reach of these technologies remains narrow. And unless and until you get private investors involved in this technology development and expansion, you're going to keep the technology too narrow. There's military applications for technology that maybe those stay narrow, but the companies building that tech need a broader market than just the government in order to be wildly
Wow.
successful.
So, and that's really interesting. So you're saying that at at the policy side, there was a recognition that they needed a basically broader markets to get the best stuff made. I imagine that on the capital side, they were thrilled to hear that because that was another way
Right.
in, right? So interesting, and I could also imagine the argument that what greater, what could be a greater application of America's strengths than that model,
Yeah.
presumably with some adult supervision preventing the, I guess what you might call preventing the moral hazard of creating weapon systems or something like that far beyond their actual market application or their defense application, resulting in flooding the world with more and more. I'm just spitballing
Yeah.
here, but that's a really interesting. It's a really interesting policy change, almost. And I would imagine that directly links to your transition from government to investor side. You, can you
Yeah, I mean
share some
that's it's
thoughts about
definitely
that?
tied in because recognizing. So I mean, I left government with the intent of driving innovation into the national security ecosystem, because even though I was on what is colloquially called the pointy end of the spear, the part you're supposed to poke at the enemy, um, we didn't always have access to the best. Yeah, some of the kit looked like straight out of Call of Duty, but some of it was duct taped together. Some of it was, a hodgepodge of stuff that we fitted together to make it work.
Interesting.
And so in a lot of times, we had minutes sometimes between being notified that something was going down somewhere in the world and the airplane showing up to take us there. Like we're literally planning our missions in flight, and so we have to
Wow.
have everything ready to go with no notice. And yeah,
Now, was that a limitation of the technology available to you, or just the reality of the world, things happening, and the need to respond urgently?
so I mean, it was a mix of the need to respond urgently and not being able to necessarily then go out and find what
Oh,
would
sure.
fit
Okay.
that situation. But
Okay.
also, like there was nothing being necessarily pushed to us. We had to find it or develop it ourselves, and there wasn't a huge sector of the economy outside of the Lockheed Martins and the Boeings that was
Yeah.
working on defense tech. Um,
Interesting.
and
Well,
so yeah, that really hindered things.
It reminds me of of a naive question I asked early on at JPL. We were it was early in the CubeSat era, 2010 or 11, right around when the first time I had the confidence to ask stupid questions, which I now delight in because once in a while they're good questions. But I asked, why don't we build internally for the JPL mission planning teams? Why don't we build a little Amazon.com for all the available components out there? So when
Yeah.
scientists and engineers are trying to design, have a science goal, they say, okay, we need to look down at this wildfire prone region with these sensors, so they can just shop around internally more or less and save that time. And of course, the answer was, and I'm curious if this is the case in defense tech, is well, none of those suppliers want to have their pricing and technical data just out there, and that and
Right,
that
right.
then that the capabilities and costs are to me it seemed at the time it seemed paradoxically secret when my perception was, well, they want to sell these things. Why don't they tell us what they cost? But of course, it's not quite that simple. So for competitive reasons and I'm sure all kinds of other things. Do you find the same thing in defense tech, or
Yeah.
where there's even more reasons and literal obligations, I imagine, to keep certain things secret or otherwise?
Yeah, and that has been something that's held back a lot of innovation. Are those silos, figuring out what can be shared, what can't. Even your question you started out, you were asking about how close do satellites need to be before you can observe them. Like arguably, somebody developing avoidance measures for satellites would need to know something like that. But maybe they're working for a commercial company and can't be told the capabilities of the satellite sensors, and so are told something that is unclassified. They can detect it at 500 miles, whatever. Something just absurd, and it's like, well, at that distance, like you're not avoiding anything at 500 miles.
Right, right.
Like if I have that much notice, like why do I need a system?
Yeah, you're not going to pay for
Right.
another subsystem to avoid
Right.
an impossible collision.
And then there is that, and that then creates incentives for companies to be like, well, okay, if that's the range, then we need something that does things close in, and they internally develop a sensor to do that. And then they get it and they pitch it to the DoD, and the DoD's like, oh, we don't need that close-in sensor. It's
Yeah.
like, what are we doing over here? Like,
Yeah, yeah, and I see that from the proposal management and business development
yeah,
side all the time, where you look at a government opportunity and it's like they tell you what they want,
yep,
but there's two ways to submit, and one of them is classified or at least controlled. I don't even know the right language, and I'm not trying to use it because I've never been cleared. I guess I want to make that I want to keep that clear.
you don't want to go
But
back to
but
prison. I get it.
but when I see those things, I think, well, clearly that's an invitation for someone to submit something I can't possibly compete with. And obviously, I realize there's good reasons for that. But as you said, that I can't avoid the logical conclusion that that's going to result in a lot of wasted effort and perhaps not the greatest value to the government because
Yeah.
of that limited competitor marketplace. So is that what, when you hear about politically, once in a while you hear someone saying, "Oh, everything's classified. It's way too aggressive." It strikes me as, or I think I read somewhere once that it was saying basically they applied classification labels to almost everything because it's easier than figuring out what actually needs it.
Oh,
I
I
is that a
used to be the worst offender of that. So there was a widget on our emails that before you sent any emails, this thing would pop up and say, what is this email classified? And you could go through and list every piece of that email that individually, what was classified, what that classification level was, and the justification for it. Or you could list the entire email at the highest classification level and just say it was as a result of multiple classification reasons. And so
Okay.
that is two buttons to push, and then my email goes.
Sure. So
And yeah.
yeah, and it saves.
And you saw that with slides, with everything. It was, this is the easy button.
Sure.
We're doing 10 things at once. Not the right button, but
Yeah.
and
Well, I just
that
had a
was fun.
terrible. I just had a terrible idea that for anything like that, that would be a great application of large language models. All you have to do is
Right.
tell the AI what the classified stuff should be, and what could go wrong
Oh
there.
no,
So,
exactly. I think it's a beautiful way to do that. And like we used to joke that like we're sending emails back and forth about when we're going to dinner, and those are like classified top secret, and it's going to like ruin somebody's day in the future going through and determining what's classified and what's not because they're like this is marked top secret. It's like one of these people like undercover, like what we got to like dig into this.
yeah,
And so in 75 years, you'll be able to read some of the stuff that I wrote about, like a funny meme I sent to somebody. That
yeah,
top secret meme.
that's funny.
Yeah.
So it certainly sounds like there's a lot of incentives, if only for getting through your day at a computer. It sounds like a challenging set of incentives to make sure the right message is out there for the right people in different marketplaces, whether investors or engineering or what have you. And it sounds like this realization post COVID is an attempt to improve that. How does one? It still seems like you have the same problem where the government can't actually ask for what it needs from a public or a privately owned organization because
Yeah.
what they need is classified. Because what if you say what you need, it means you don't have it, and that would be a sensitive. I mean, how is that navigated in the current kind of ecosystem or era?
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, this gets to that classification thing we were just talking about. That like there is a lot of institutional inertia around classifications. I've been read into a number of different programs that maybe a few hundred people were read into them, if that. And I left the briefing and I like asked the briefer. I was like, "You just told me the F-22 is stealthy." That felt like all you said. We were in there for like 15 minutes. Are you sure? You told me like why it's stealthy, but like, okay, how is that supposed to help me? like, and like saying it's really, really stealthy is all I need to be able to do. And that's unclassified. So why do we have this? I understand the manufacturer and the president might need to understand some of this, but for the rest of us in this program, it's like, what are you telling us? And so it's like some things, the minute details were very close hold. But then everything related to that got wrapped up into it. And it's like all of the information about the F-22 is at that same special access level. And it would get pretty weird because now, well, the pilot can't know that. And it's like, that's kind of weird. Okay.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. But I mean, then it goes to your part about the contracting. Like, almost no proposals are being read by a technical expert in the DoD. So when a solicitation goes out, the responses are read by the contracting officer, and they're basically going through the solicitation, which they sent out after talking to the technical office. So the technical office gave them the requirements. They translated that into a solicitation. Maybe that went back to the technical office to make sure it looked good. Maybe not. Nobody wants to read the solicitations, so I can, engineers could be forgiven for being like it's good enough. But then the contracting officer uses that as the grading rubric.
sure.
Like, all right, how closely does this align? And that I think is a failure of the system that was not a failure when, it was handed to friends and family. That it's like, I know Jeff can handle this.
Yes,
Let me give it
connect.
to Jeff. I know he's not going to embezzle. Like,
Yeah,
this'll be good.
connecting back. Yeah,
Right.
historically interesting. Yeah, it is tempting to come to that conclusion that no one technical is reading these things, but I think almost for your own mental health working on these things, you have to pretend that the details matter. I mean, interestingly compared to NASA, where I think that it's quite the opposite. I think
Yeah.
I've seen mission proposal feedback that shows an extreme attention to technical
Yeah.
details, which the it's tempting to draw comparisons or to compare and contrast NASA and DoD. Probably not the most useful thing to do, but I'm grateful that my training, so to speak, was in the NASA world with that attention to detail because, again, if you're spending $4 billion to send a machine to Mars for the sole purpose, and I think we forget this sometimes, of sending back data.
Yeah.
The whole point of building the rover is to get the data back. The rover itself, as much as it very much feels like 10,000 people came together and had one baby made of metal, and then we threw it to another planet, it's actually just a means to an end of the data itself.
Right.
And so it really, really matters that every single pixel on that detector or every square nanometer is as perfect as it can be.
Right.
Because the reason you send that sensor to Mars that's this big in an instrument that's this big in something the size of a car is to get back some ones and zeros. And so I find it interesting to compare the approaches of the different agencies. Although I recognize it's probably not that useful, other than to know what hat you're wearing, depending on the customer that you're talking to.
So I have a 0% success rate with NSF SIBRs. About 65% with DoD ones. But my NSF SIBRs always come back with the same feedback, and it is, we don't think the technical team or the team can technically execute this. And in many cases, the team has already executed it. We have written this SIBR in such a way that it's like, we're going to do a proof of concept for this as we're holding the actual tool. Like, personally, I submitted a SIBR for a nutraceutical that would help buy down the risk for radiation from cancer patients.
Okay.
Already had created it. We already had in situ test results that it reduced the damage in tissue. I'm not a scientist. I'm listed as the program manager for this. And the response was that, I didn't have a technical degree and no technical background, so they didn't think the team could execute on developing this. And it's like, it's already done. It already works.
Wow.
And so there is like this weird thing, at least with NSF, in that specific niche, this sense that like, I can't see how you would do this. So you probably can.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I was just an NSF reviewer a few weeks ago, and you really have to consciously put the biases aside. I mean, I got extremely lucky in that my first proposal for my own idea to the NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts Program, I was very explicit that I did not have a technical degree, but I have a very technical team, obviously, JPL engineers and experts.
Yeah.
And to her endless credit, my manager at the time, Jackie Green, encouraged me to apply, even though I was recognizing, look, am I just going to get thrown out just because I don't have the degree? She said, you got to try. And they gave it to me. And I'll never forget that. And really, it kind of leads to this podcast on at the risk of being dramatic, where the authenticity of saying, look, I don't have the degree, but I have the team because I don't have the degree, and they're willing to work on it. They think it's reasonable. So I guess it just gets back to different different approaches for reviewing as different agencies. I had an experience with the NIH, which I have the greatest respect for, but my own experience was kind of frustrating in that back in this startup that I mentioned, the medical radar from JPL, they had heard about this NSF program office had heard about it from my from the investor publicity, and a program manager invited me to apply and was very excited about it. And so I learned how to write an NIH proposal and spent a lot of time on it and a lot of runway on it.
Yeah.
And the feedback was basically, "Hey, we love it. Propose again in 6 months."
Yep.
And I would graciously argue that that is an opportunity for improvement in the way these systems work. That may or may not come. I did not reapply. I applied for something else and didn't get that either. But it was an interesting experience in the difference between these agencies, because again, it's all just people and systems, like you said.
Yeah.
Some of which, including NSF and NIH, probably that do go back to the post-war, the post-war boom of federal government involvement, and some of it probably during or before the war that then got formalized after. I would imagine. One of the things I've learned from my wife and about medical care and medical practice is that it's actually the wars that often result in major changes of standard of care, because suddenly they have to teach 10,000 people in a weekend how to do something. And that becomes the standard of care, whether it was post-Civil War or World War I or II. Not that relevant, but I find that kind of I find that kind of interesting, just from the practical point of view of how do these large institutions work? How do you ensure something like a common language and experience and skills, in any large enough system?
Yeah, no, and I think, I've been saying this for a little while, that America creates new systems out of war. The country was created out of the Revolutionary War. It was revamped out of the Civil War. The current era was modeled after World War II. And so there's, all this discussion around like, oh, we need change, we need this different, we need that different. America evolves out of the ashes of conflict. And
Wow.
so, right or wrong, that's the only time we really do.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, we're also a uniquely warlike country. We've been in war for something like 83% of our existence, which is statistically improbable.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And probably only remotely sustainable because of our accident of geography.
Yeah.
I'd imagine.
We
Interesting.
have incredible both human capital, geographic capital, and actual monetary capital.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Sometimes I think about what's this all going to be written up as 1,000 years from now? What are the lessons going to be of when this whole time is referred to something like the time of William the Conqueror?
Yeah.
That kind of summarizes 1,000 years ago. I'm sure we could talk about that. So let's talk about Thor Dynamics. I'm curious. When I saw that on LinkedIn, I thought, of all the things that you could get involved in a more hands-on way, why that? And I mean, I know why I would, because lasers are cool, but curious about your thoughts about how you allocate your personal limited resources of time and energy and brain power.
Yeah. No, and I think that, so I mean, it's funny, one of the things I did do in the CIA that I can talk about a little bit is I ended up being one of the only high energy laser experts at the agency. And it was through an accident of attrition and retirements that what started as multiple PhDs and long-term experts ended up with pretty much me handling that portfolio. And I thought, like, this is funny. Like, my understanding of lasers going into this was don't point the laser pointer in your eye. Through several years of work, developed a pretty good technical understanding of a lot of these systems. but I still talked about them as though, hey, it's a giant laser pointer. It melts things in space, or like, you know, don't point it towards you. And that was viewed by a lot of the customers as like, oh, look at him, he's being accessible, he's not drowning in all these details. And I was like, in a lot of cases, this is all I've got. Like, but I thought, you know, this was a fun thing I did. I'm done. It'll never come back around. And at a dinner in December, was talking with the CEO of Thor Dynamics, and I mentioned like some of the work I'd done for the CIA related to this, and he got excited and started showing me the prototype and what they're doing, and we just started going back and forth about like how groundbreaking a lot of these improvements were in the laser, whether it was the cooling system, the range, the weight. Historically, something that was up to 20 kilowatts of laser power would take the better part of a semi-truck. And, you know, there's massive cooling systems. You need large mirrors to point the laser. This is about 160 pounds, fit in 2 tough boxes and a little pedestal. And the laser itself is in something a little bit bigger than a shoebox. Most of that equipment is the power supply and the control system. And so, you know, been working with them since December to, you know, as they're finishing the prototype, going through fundraising, and really saw an opportunity here to, you know, as we see more and more adversaries betting that U.S. high-end systems are not going to be able to defeat drone swarms, and more turning to hundreds or thousands of drones as counterweights to the fact that they can not see our aircraft or missiles coming. They're like, well, fine, we'll weather a missile storm, and then we'll sink an aircraft carrier with $10,000 worth of drones that they just can't shoot down in time. I saw Thor as the only credible solution to that cost curve, where if this just into a 48 volt outlet on a military vehicle, can acquire a target in less than a second, melt it out of the sky, and do that 30 times in a minute. Well, now you've got a credible sniper rifle for the counter drone era.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I you know, not having any direct experience with military laser systems, the cost of shooting down drones with what I presume are missiles that cost tens to thousands of dollars more.
Yeah.
It's kind of like it's like the inverse of the what's that rule that processing power doubles every 2 years, whatever. It's sort of like it's sort of like the inverse of Moore's law, where the low tech, low equipped adversary can outcompete because our countermeasure costs 1,000 times their measure, their active measure. So it wasn't even a technical observation from my part. I said, oh wow, okay, if you can reduce the cost of the laser by this much, well then they got to find something else to throw at you.
Right.
So I also imagine shooting down a drone with I don't know what the smallest missile available is, but I imagine that's like hitting a fly with a pickup, with a semi truck.
Yeah, and then your pickup is ruined. Every fly you hit, you have to waste the pickup truck.
Yeah, and I could imagine if I put on my bad guy hat, I imagine you could even make it harder, where you could probably trick the defender into blowing up his own thing by just flying near it and forcing him to shoot you down.
Right.
And have your defender spend $100,000 to blow up his own target because you had a $10 drone floating nearby and you had to do something about it.
Yep.
So fascinating. So
yeah. No, we see even like the non-kinetic solutions that are developed, whether it's high power microwaves or these nets that are like shot at the drone at relatively close range.
Okay.
Even those are more expensive, and it's fewer engagements per minute than the laser. And so and not as precise.
Yeah. Well, it kind of goes to the idea of sending electrons instead of atoms somewhere.
Right.
Although this case it's photons instead.
Yeah.
Even better.
Exactly.
Interesting. So I think we're gonna wind this episode down. That's a really, I think, an interesting place to stop. But I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Maybe we can do another episode in
Oh, yeah.
6 months or so, but particularly on this acquisition process and what we can learn in the business community, in the government contracting community, on how to effectively meet the needs of the government, which remains the biggest customer for everyone, and is likely
Yeah.
to stay so. So that will be interesting to see as it plays out. I think
Yeah.
for people who are listening to this. So
No, completely agree.
yeah, and I'm going to put the books we mentioned in the show notes. I would still encourage everyone to read Devil Take the Hindmost, A History of Financial Speculation, which puts the financial side of the current political environment into context. But I think we're going to call it here for this episode. Tim, thank you very much for joining. I always enjoy talking with you. I always learn something, and my book pile always gets bigger. So with that, I think we'll end it, and good luck, and I'll talk to you soon.
Alrighty. Sounds good.
All right,
Thanks, Jeff.
thanks again. Bye.